If a GRC is a sort of key and you're going to hand out lots more copies to a more diverse group, the first job of legislators is to be really clear about what that key could unlock. Convener, speaking from 20 years in policy making, most of that in what's now the Scottish Government, and years since researching public policy, I'm serious when I say that the process leading to the introduction of this bill has been exceptionally poor and a recipe for bad law.
By doing away with all eligibility criteria, this bill effectively opens up the process to everyone. There is a frankly naive expectation that no one will act dishonestly and that solemn declarations are the most binding of magic. We are concerned that the committee set the schedule for witnesses before studying the evidence and that there has been gaps in previous panels. For example, no mention of the CAS review or detransition on the panel on young people. Women still suffer disproportionately from domestic violence. We are overlooked in medical trials. Our health conditions taken less seriously. We are paid less and take on more caring responsibility. Our sex is a factor in this, not our clothing preference or our pronouns. By erasing and confusing sex in law and policy, the Scottish Government will not resolve any of these equalities, but they will make it considerably harder to monitor injustice and to fight for change.
A system of self-ID removes any variable differentiating trans women with a GRC from males, aside from having completed a legal process. This is particularly relevant for prison allocation and management. Here I note that there's no evidence at all that the rate of offending for trans women conforms to the rate of offending for females. Rather, the evidence indicates that the male rates of offending persist.
This bill sends the message that the biological sex we are matters less than the gender identity that we feel. But lesbians and gays are defined by and legally protected as people who are same-sex attracted. If you replace the fixed, definable reality of sex with the indefinable, fluid, vague concept of gender identity, the rights that we fought for decades for are erased. If sex doesn't matter, gays don't matter. The sad thing is, we know the majority of kids with dysphoria eventually grow out of it. We also know the vast majority, if left alone, will grow up to be happy young lesbians, gays or bisexuals. That's why we have a particular concern about lowering the age at which someone can get a GRC to 16. If the state steps in to validate the confused feelings of a 16-year-old girl who thinks she's a boy, this risks crystallising an identity that's just temporary. It also makes it harder for her to revert to feeling like a girl now that she's been told by the state she really is a boy. Gender identity was a concept popularised by the discredited psychologist John Money in the late 1950s. He provided no proof, and as of yet, despite over 5 decades of research, no convincing scientific evidence has been produced to support this idea. The insertion of self-identification into our laws is just the beginning. It will then be used to trigger a whole new series of ever stranger demands that will chip away at gay rights, the interests of women, children's mental health, and the public's tolerance.
So from our point of view, the medical gatekeeping it connects in there, it avoids this dislocation, and it creates an oversight. And a lot of the problems that people are raising with self-declaration are, if you have some medical oversight, as you still have for passports, of course, then you have an external third party. And that brings in something which actually deals with an awful lot of the concerns that people have about self-declaration. I'll pass to others.
If gender dysphoria is an issue, it should be explored in a therapeutic and caring way.
That's talked about. The umbrella, the trans umbrella now, is radically different in its composition. It's bigger, it's more diverse, and that's, that's where we are.
And I always say, well, once you have opened to a wider population, and the public know that you've opened a GRC to a wider population that may include 6'2" blokes, people who look like blokes with a big beard, then how is the public supposed to know when a 6'2" person with a beard who looks like a guy walks into a girl's changing room, how are they supposed to know whether this person has a GRC, is trans-identified or not? And there's a huge loophole here.
So we've actually, what's one of the curious things about this, it's a law that jumps past the passport system, and no one ever discusses that, yet everyone's happy with the passport system, which involves medical oversight.
Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board pointed this out, that they were worried about if you were giving people a piece of paper that said legally the other sex, that would increase pressure on services. And of course, the last thing anybody would want to do is increase the pressure on the NHS services.
This bill is erasing gender dysphoria. It's a huge, growing mental health crisis in this country, and we think resources should be poured into it. There should be more doctors, and there should be more psychiatrists, and it should be more, therapeutic care. This is removing one opportunity to insert that.
That it's incredibly difficult to find out. Well, it's impossible to find out if someone has a GRC. So, unless they volunteer that information. So what providers are then reliant on is honesty on the part of the person turning up. Now, actually, there's a huge elephant in the room there when you're talking about people who are clearly one sex or the other, but have legal documentation that say they're the opposite sex. And then it's impossible for anybody to point this out without risking some kind of legal sanction themselves. And what we now see, for example, in NHS policies, in even the Scottish Women's Aid policy, is that arguments that a GRC, for example, changes someone's sex for the purposes of the genuine occupational requirement. Now, we would say that was wrong. If you're an employer and you're recruiting for somebody for a female role, perhaps to provide intimate care, you can go back and make sure that that person really is a woman, because otherwise, you are, unfortunately, it is opening up this. And the NHS lady, and actually a couple of years ago, said that because of this, they could not guarantee that people would get female carers because of this conflict between the two acts.
See, I want to talk a little bit about religion. You've just mentioned carers here. There's something that deeply concerns me, being from the Indian religion, that if, for example, my mother goes to a doctor, she will ask for a woman doctor, and and basically she got somebody trans, and she didn't know. That would break a lot of religions, especially the Muslim religion, and even going into single-sex spaces. I know many Muslims have voiced with me to ask these questions, and Indians to ask, where does that lie? Because do we change our religions then? What's your feeling on that, Susan?
There are real fears and real concerns, and we've heard similarly from women in Glasgow who've started self-excluding from going to the gym because the women-only sessions, they checked. Really what this does is it hurts the most vulnerable women. It hurts women from ethnic minorities. It hurts women who have been victims of abuse. It hurts working class women the most, because they are the women who will suffer when all this is removed. And these Muslim women have said they are frightened of speaking up because they see the abuse that women get anyway. And then that is then compounded by people telling them that their religion is in and of itself a bigoted religion. And I've seen that. I've seen that recently with the very brave author Anjali Rauf, who stands up for refugees and has stood up and said that single-sex spaces are important for Muslim women. And the abuse that she has got has been sexist and Islamophobic and racist. And it is truly appalling that this has been allowed under cover of this movement, these really, really horrific abuses have been almost encouraged, frankly. And yes, it's a big issue.
Discrimination effects on changing your sex. If you have a change of sex in law, you can bring direct discrimination cases, and that changes things. That changes your ability. It's much easier to bring a direct discrimination case, and providers will take that into account. It's one of the things they look at the risk analysis of how they're going to set their policy, what's going to happen, what's the bigger risk that I get this kind of case for someone claiming direct discrimination who is trans but now has a female GRC, or I get an indirect discrimination case from some, say, Muslim women that were being discriminated against, or women in general saying that we will not be able to use this space, and they will always worry more about the direct discrimination case. So that's the first thing about the GRC. If it has this effect on the Equality Act, which is important to say is contested. I mean, you're hearing people who disagree with us telling you there's no effect. So, but it's a very messy situation, and it's very unsatisfactory that you're being asked to legislate in that context, I would say.
Yeah. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for raising the issue of religion. As an Orthodox Jewish woman, I see that women in my own community are going to be unprotected. So thank you for raising that. We know that there are prisoners with a GRC who've been convicted of the most serious violent and sexual offences against women and who have intact male genitalia. So if we look at the example which was reported in the media over the weekend, which was of a male-bodied prisoner, trans woman prisoner, with a GRC, with intact male genitalia, who had, as was reported, consensual sex with a very young female prisoner. If that prisoner had not had a GRC, firstly, they probably wouldn't have been in the female estate to start with, because the things like anatomy are taken into consideration when making those decisions. But now, where is that prisoner to be moved? This group of prisoners, trans women with a GRC, male prisoners, they are risk assessed as women. They are risk assessed against the standards that are in place for female prisoners. And they are risk assessed using the comparator that's in place for female prisoners. So that means two things. It means, firstly, the set of risk assessment tools which can be used for them is only that which can be used for female prisoners, and that is particularly relevant when we look at sexual offenders. And secondly, it means that one of these prisoners can only be transferred to the male estate if that self-same decision would also be made for a woman. We've had instances of flashing and sexual exhibitionism, publicly describing masturbatory fantasies and intent, grooming of young and vulnerable women and engaging in sexual relations, threats of physical violence, sexual assault and threats of rape. So because we're treating this cohort of prisoners as if they are literally women, we can't make that decision to move them to the male estate. They have the strength of the man. They have the appearance of man to these vulnerable women in prison. So when we come to policy decisions, having a GRC really, really, really seems to matter. And women suffer. Thank you.
Okay,
You can't, the ability to make those flexible case-by-case decisions, which I know the Scottish Prison Service claims to currently be able to do,
yes,
that is then removed when you privilege GRC status, and that presents a risk, as we can see, looking at south of the border.
Policy. If you start having a lot, you drop the threshold, I think we all think that one of the subpopulations that you will see applying for GRCs more quickly are people in prison. They will see it as a leveraging thing, a control, so it becomes a way, and it will be quite hard for the prison service to say, well, no, you can't have one. And that's our worry. So I think this is actually very fixable in the bill. The problem is once you bring in the legal piece of paper and the change of status, all that experience can be overwritten by one court hearing. It's very easy, though. This is one of the easiest things in the bill to fix.
So where would that legal challenge come from?
From a prisoner. Prisoners are very litigious as a general group. There's a lot of litigation from prisoners.
Okay.
We do allow 16-year-olds to do things under law, and we know there are areas where we have more concerns. I mean, for example, a 16-year-old cannot get a tattoo, so because that's considered quite a major decision. So it seems slightly odd if we say they can get a tattoo, but they can change their sex. One of the things that this committee has to bottom out is what you mean by gender, because there are no definitions of gender. I don't think the Scottish Government has a definition of gender. That their cultural meanings and patterns of behaviour, experience and personality labelled masculine or feminine, and their clothing, hairstyles, mannerisms, speech patterns and social interactions. Now, I have a great problem with putting those things into law, because those things are fundamentally sexist. Most people experience sex and sexism on the basis of their bodies. And what we've seen with the increase in young girls, especially, being referred to the services, is that a lot of them have suffered abuse. A lot of them are deeply uncomfortable with their bodies. We know young girls in the past have been the cohort who self-harm, who have anorexia. And, you know, in a highly sexist world, I don't blame young girls for wanting to escape from that. But I think the roots of that need, and this goes back to this idea of diagnosis, we need to think about that. And so then, you know, there are a lot of people who have persistent and ongoing gender dysphoria. And then if that is persistent into adulthood, that is a different cohort. But what we're seeing, especially now in countries like the US, who are ahead of the curve on this, are the growing number of detransitioners. And that is something you have to be really, really worried about, because those girls have had irreversible treatment, some of them are left sterile and without sexual function. And it is...
I would say please talk to parents of young people who have been through this. The Bayswater group would be one. Please talk to detransitioners. Please talk to and to medical practitioners who deal with people, younger people in the system, because it's a really important group. What you do here will be very important and resonant, and making sure that you've taken evidence that you should from beyond ourselves. I hope that's helpful. I'm conscious of time.
I would say lots of 16-year-olds are certain about lots of things, and then they're equally certain about the very opposite when they're 18. So I would only say it's incumbent upon us, before we hand out certificates crystallising what they thought they were certain about at 16, that we're not making it difficult for them at the age 18 to go back on that. That's my concern about lowering the age to 16. The BBC's only just a year ago, partly through our pressure, withdrawn a video, an educational video that told children as young as 8 that there are 100 genders. In fact, there may be an infinite number. I mean, so there's a culture through celebrities, through peer pressure, through loads of social media nonsense that kids are receiving that I think is likely to confuse them. And I think that all we're asking is that we're aware of the confusion in young people's minds. Sinead Watson, who's a very brave detransitioner, she says she knows hundreds of other detransitioners. And these are, in the case of Sinead, she was very sure at the age of 19, I think, but there are other girls and boys that she speaks to who were sure at the age of 18 what gender they were, and then they had to undo everything that they had done to become the sex that they always were.
When you're talking, it just sounds so similar to what I used to hear back, you know, in the 80s, and the same rhetoric that people are influenced by celebrity and the music industry. And there was that fear that, you know, if we educate our children in regards to Section 28 on, you know, LGBT issues, that it was going to make them gay, which, I mean, I don't know if you agree, but I'm assuming you agree that that is not possible. People are who they are. Can you see those similarities in your arguments?
Well, I mean, you remind me of a phrase that's used in a book that I can recommend by Abigail Schreier, Irreversible Damage. She looks at the terrible effects of gender identity theory on, on girls throughout America. And she says, gay activists in the past were desperate to tell their parents what they were. Trans activists are desperate to tell, or trans kids are desperate to tell their parents what they are not. And that's a very different thing, because if you identify as something you are, you can win acceptance and you can describe what that positive aspect of you is. But if you're saying what you are not, and that's what these kids are doing, I am not male, I am not female, that is a very different sort of process. And I don't see any comparison. I was there during Section 28. I fought against it. All of the people in LGB Alliance management team and the trustees fought against it. There is no comparison. What that comparison is doing, what people from Stonewall who now compare it to the battle against Section 28 is using the good name of the gay rights movement to try to make this new set of demands respectable. They're completely different. There is nothing that is similar between sexual orientation and gender identity, and there's nothing similar between these two campaigns. We know what they are. They're male or female. and they are going to gender identity clinics, usually to try to change their bodies. And so that's why I say it's something that you're not, because you're trying to change your body. And if we are encouraging young people at the age of 16, in fact, encouraging young people at the age of 12 and 13 to take puberty blockers because they know what they are not.
Who's encouraging, can I ask, sorry? When you say we who's
Well,
we?
any of the LGBT charities who are advocating for conversion therapy ban.
They're forcing puberty block.
I didn't say they were forcing, I said
No.
they were encouraging.
Encouraging.
Yes,
They're encouraging.
Yes. They're advocating puberty blockers, and puberty blockers are very dangerous and experimental drugs that have unknown impacts on 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds. A 12-year-old who takes puberty blockers up to the age of 16 and then takes cross-sex hormones for a few years stands a very good chance of being infertile. And I think it's a disgrace that LGBT charities are encouraging medical experimentation on young people.
I think we're just pretending when we say that we are unable to differentiate between a 6'2" male person with facial hair and a 6'2" female person with facial hair. I think we can. We can. Certainly women in prison can, and they experience people, trans women, very viscerally as male and as presenting a male risk to them. And in respect of one of these prisoners who's held in one of the male prisons up here in Scotland, I'm in correspondence with someone else who's housed in that prison, and that prisoner tells me that that trans man's sex was very rapidly and correctly identified within the prison population as being female. And I think that's a massive risk to that individual.
Right. So
Because the risk is what happens if there's a legal case in the courts.
okay, so you're noting that it's the diagnosis of
No, it's the GRC. It's what
what's
we-
the risk? The main
the risk is of
sorry,
a
so I
court
can take
case of a
note.
prisoner with a GRC taking a court case, taking the Scottish Government to court and saying that a policy which doesn't give that GRC extra weight, which is where we currently are, that policy is illegal, is unlawful, and that, in fact, the Scottish policy should mirror English policy because a GRC has changed their sex in law and should override all those assessments.
And that is because of the reforms that we're looking at just
That
now, or is
would
that
be-
with the existing GRC?
At the moment, it's a tiny risk because GRC holders are very small in number and because the criteria for GRC are very hard to meet within the prison system. But when you go to self-declaration, it becomes a much lower, the risk, it becomes immeasurably higher of this. I'd be really happy. I'm conscious of time, Convener.
Yes.
Would it be
sorry,
helpful?
Convener,
We'd be
I'll
very,
just-
very happy to write about
If
it and
you
explain
can-
that.
yeah,
Yes,
send
we'll do
Last
that.
thing about the policy, the SPS policy is, as I said at the beginning, is currently under review, and we don't know what the reviewed policy will be. The reviewed policy may well be to more closely mirror or to exactly mirror what's south of the border with the MOJ policy, which will see GRC status as I said, not guaranteeing allocation to the prisoner's state that matches the sex that corresponds to your acquired gender,
does
but
that
making it
have evidence
far
of that, or is that-
much more likely.
Is that anecdotal, or
Is
there
what
evidence of
anecdotal?
that? Okay.
That it operates south of the border like that?
Yeah.
No, I
but
can
not
give
in
you.
Scotland.
I can give you all of that in a follow-up email. But
Okay.
we don't know what the
Can- I'm
Scottish
gonna-
Prison
That's fine.
Service is
Yeah,
going to do.
Understand, convener, sorry.
Okay, thanks. Obviously, we're approaching the time that we had allocated, but I'm going to take the decision to extend this session by a further half an hour. I hope folk are okay with that. Maggie, you were wanting a very, very quick supplementary on that point.
Just actually on the 16 and 17, and Susan and Lucy, you both refer to the Scottish sentencing guidelines. If I could ask you for a yes or no answer, please, because of time. Because the Scottish sentencing guidelines talk about have a distinction for 25 for under 25. So are you suggesting that the age for obtaining a GRC should be raised to 25?
No, I don't think that's a decision that
No, I just wondered why you raised the Scottish sentencing guidelines.
because it was about
then.
brain maturity and about the cognitive process. So it's about how young people make decisions. That's the crucial thing. It's about how young people make decisions. And I think, you know, what's not been said here and needs to be said is that there is a really important piece of work that has happened, is the Cass review. And I think you need to have a session with Hilary Cass on her findings about how young people have been treated within the system and their understanding of that. And I think you really need to get onto that, because that should provide a lot more answers on this than we can do in a yes or no answer.
Thanks.
To definitely close this session, Pam Duncan Glancy, very, very quickly, and if you can just say who you want to answer.
Thank you. It's just a follow-up on the 16 and 17-year-old part. Some panellists, including yourselves, have concerned around the lack of capacity assessment for 16 and 17-year-olds in the bill. Would you support any amendment to the bill that would create as an assumption that all 16 and 17-year-olds do have capacity to understand the process and its legal implications, as is the case in other law in Scotland, unless in specific circumstances an assessment were to find this not to be the case?
I think I would like you as a committee to talk to more people actually about this. I don't feel that I want to give a yes or no answer to a question like that. I think what I'm encouraged by is the sense in committee that 16 and 17-year-olds require a lot of attention, and all I can really do is say talk to more people and get a really sense for yourselves as to what you think the safeguards and protections are if we're going to drop to 16. And I think that's just an if needs to stay in there. That this is a big issue that you probably need more sessions on, more evidence. That would be my feeling.
Thank you.
I would only say what changed to 18-year-olds, 16 to 18-year-olds in the last decade or the last 20 years that suddenly we need a change. I don't think there's any evidence that 16-year-olds have changed cognitively since 2004, and so I don't see why we should be changing the law.
Thank you. Can I move on to Rachel Hamilton, please?
Well, it's quite timely. I do need to lie down, I think. But now, Susan, you mentioned the Cass review, and it looks like there's a possible suggestion that some of the panel members today would say, you know, look at the Cass review and pause the GRA reform here in Scotland. So it's really just, I looked at the Cass review, and it was about the point that they highlighted about the lack of routine and consistent data collection, which meant it wasn't possible to track the outcomes for children and young people. And Malcolm, you specifically mentioned, you know, making sure that there is more therapeutic care and defining that service model and I suppose workforce implications. I just wanted anyone to expand on this. I know you've all had your good fair share of speaking, but who would like to kick off on that specific? Susan, perhaps, because you mentioned it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this has been a bit of a movable. It's much worse in Scotland, actually. So the situation in England for monitoring and long-term is actually better than in Scotland, because we're not even recording what the sex of the children who present at the Sandiford are at the moment. And we've done a lot of FOIs on the Sandiford over the years, and it's incredibly difficult to get information out, and sometimes you have to go to the individual health boards, and it's been difficult to get information out on ages. But we do know that children as young as 4 are being referred there, and that there are a cohort of children around 10, 11 and so on. And there is very little work being done to find out what the long-term outcomes are for these children. Well, there are no long-term outcomes for these children. What we find from countries like Sweden now is that they are putting the brakes on a bit, because they're finding that actually the long-term outcomes are very negative for children.
Okay, Lucy.
That's what we have a shared. There's no disagreement between anybody about these children and their well-being mattering. And what matters here is policy and law which supports those young people's well-being, that is made where you make your law in the context of understanding the broader context. You can't make law as though the world's not out there, as though other things, it wasn't going, as though it's going to be hermetically sealed and not, you know, you're dropping a stone in a pond and it will ripple. So this is the richness of your evidence base here. I can't emphasise enough. It feels to us very thin. We're worried that you've had one session on this, and it feels inadequate to us at the moment.
I'm actually horrified to learn that, you know, we don't have the ability, or we are not conducting that data collection so that we can give the best services to children and young people. Because if this is, brought forward and the reforms are accepted within the Parliament, then, as you say, we're putting the sort of cart before the horse, and therefore, how can the workforce implications and the services that need to be provided be there if we don't have that evidence to suggest that we know how many people and what circumstances they are in, are experiencing. So I'm really, Convener, I'm really shocked that the committee haven't had that opportunity to get into the detail of that. But
when people compare it to Section 28, this whole debate, the reason it's not the same is that after gay rights were, given, the percentage of gay people in the population didn't go up. Not at all. It remained exactly the same. However, in the last 10 years, the number of kids who say they're trans or non-binary or queer is soaring. So there is something else happening here. And I would only say that we should look at that.
As you mentioned my name, it's possibly because we're creating a safer society, and it wasn't really as safe back in the 80s to come out.
But why hasn't the population of gay people gone up? It's so much safer for gay people than it was when I was a kid.
It has.
The percentage of the demography that say that they're lesbian or gay hasn't gone up. The percentage of people who say they are queer, non-binary, or LGBTQ, whatever that means, has soared. Not people who identify as lesbian or gay.
Oh,
anyway,
that's fine. Yeah,
that's by the by. One of the things that I think has come out of this session is the intimate link between the CAS review, what's happening in gender identity clinics and the pressure on young people, and what is being described, this bill, as a tidying up exercise to give certificates. And actually the two things combine, and they combine on the impact they're having culturally. I would want to point out that puberty blockers are a huge problem for us. I think the fact that we give 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds drugs that stop their natural physical and mental development is a medical scandal, and it will be seen as that in the future. And one of the reasons that we worry about this bill is that it creates at the age of 16 a sort of graduation, a sort of coming out. We all know as 15 and 16-year-olds we were desperate to be seen as adult. You look forward to either going to a pub or getting a driving licence or whatever. This is creating a certificate given by the government, by the state, that says you're an adult. And I think it will be putting pressure on a lot of those 12, 13, 14 and 15-year-olds to look forward to this moment when they will get their certificate. And it will increase the desire to take puberty blockers, the desire of parents to encourage their kids to take puberty blockers. I think the two things, the medicalisation of children, which is what a 12, 13 and 14-year-old person is, a child, and this government certificate is very intimately connected.
And so do you believe that that this process should actually be paused until we do consider the publication of the CAS review itself?
Absolutely, yes, yes.
Okay.
You make your declaration and you declare that over the next 6 months you'll make sure that all your other documents align, so that you've got a complete set of matching documents. So if you have a passport, if you have a driving licence, that you'll do all the documentary change, because that's something you can falsify. It means that somebody walks in and does a declaration, then goes through a process of aligning all their identity documents over 6 months. And we have suggested that you might want, we think there's strong reasons not to issue these documents to people who are on the registered sex offenders, so that gives you a period to check. Or any other kind of checks you want to do. We've talked about Section 22. The Section 22 provisions are really heavy-duty privacy protections. They are witness protection type stuff. They should not be handed out lightly. I am really worried, leaving aside anything to do with sort of bad actors, sexual. I'm extremely worried that we are looking at a state identity protection scheme which you can get by walking in and swearing a declaration. the kind of people I'm worried about are not the kind of people who are going to be very put off, I'm going to say, by the criminal offence here. And I think as a committee, and this is when I come back to being a bad government process, there seems to be no analysis, we know, in fact, there's been no analysis and no risk assessment of what it means to make available to people who are just prepared to say something, and that is it. National comparisons, what I would say as a committee you have to do is not latch on to absence of evidence, meaning evidence of absence, which is an extremely insecure way to legislate. You have to go back to first principles about people. You're politicians and you know about people. You deal with law in lots of different contexts. You know when you're making law for Scotland that you think about. For example, we know the sex offending population is extremely manipulative. It is one of the critical characteristics of at least not all sex offenders, but many sex offenders, that they are extremely, extremely manipulative. We see that. I mean, the evidence is there in multiple cases of people who have gone through, in multiple settings, sport or education or the priesthood. We have. It's not. You shouldn't need persuading that the sex offending population is very manipulative and very deceptive. People who commit fraud tend to be persuasive, unreliable, dishonest, and deceptive. I mean, this is the populations I'm worried about in the population. You have to go back. Why might somebody find it attractive to have over here an identity which is extremely well protected in law and another identity over there? Bankruptcies, fraud. Once you make it, the new population of gender recognition is going to be defined as people who are willing to walk into someone's office and swear an oath that they are going to live in their acquired gender for life. That is your new population.
Do you believe that that will predominantly be trans people?
I believe it could be anybody who's willing to do it. And that's a problem for you as a committee. I mean, I imagine we don't know who will take advantage of it.
Okay.
No adult can walk into a school. You have to go through very careful criminal checks. That's not because we think every adult is an abuser. It's because we know there's a tiny minority of adults that are an abuser. And we're not, I mean, I don't want to leave, I'm sure everyone agrees here that we don't want to leave the impression, because we have to talk about these things, because they weren't considered in the writing of the bill, we have to raise them. But we don't want to leave the impression that any of us think that the small, vulnerable community of genuine trans people are any more likely to offend than anyone else. The problem is you're creating a process that is effectively the same as taking all the restrictions on adults walking into schools. You know, there's got to be restrictions, and it's up to the government to find a way to solve this problem, that there's a tiny minority of people being protected, who need protected, but there's also a group of people who may abuse those protections, who are not genuine trans people.
These problems existed. They are problems with what is already there. But when it's expanded, they become worse. And I think that's the critical aspect to take away is, you know, I don't think it's, I think what a lot of people have said to us is, well, these are already problems. And that's true, but if they're already problems, they really should be sorted out before this is widened and before you know, those problems are compounded. So yeah, there are existing issues with the old Act, and so there are grounds probably for just going right back to the beginning with the GRA and starting again. The critical thing here is that everybody should have provision, and I think that's in the new EHRC guidance, that everybody should have the dignity of being provided for and looked after, but don't remove the dignity or the ability of women to be able to operate those spaces. And I know that there are women who work on the front line in the violence against women sector. There are even some of the women who are incredibly brave, who have spoken out, who have said that they would be prepared to come to committee. I would suggest in that context you would give them a private session, who have had real issues with accessing services, and it's something that Women and Girls in Scotland, their huge report on self-exclusion, that really needs to be looked at, and that is in terms of policy and how policy has been affected by GRA Equality Act interaction. I mean, there was recently a race, the We'd Love bicycle race, e-bike category was won by somebody who is biologically male in the women's section. And their entry criteria was very specific, that you had to be female, you had to be biologically female. And it was only because then this was found out, because this person, that they were able to say, actually, no, you won in the wrong category. So you are, again, relying on honesty. And while that becomes less of an issue in elite sports, because it's possible they do more testing, it becomes a real issue on the ground in local clubs and grassroots clubs. And that affects girls, especially at the start of their sporting career, if they don't have the same access. It needs people to be able to check the genuine biological status of people entering sports. And I know that, you know, when you say it's up to the sporting bodies, this is true, but this is another weakness, frankly, and this is a weakness that kind of permeates through all of this, that there is a societal change, and what this bill signals is part of a societal change, that we are accepting self-ID, and that message comes from the top, it comes from government, and, you know, as parliamentarians, you have an enormous responsibility to society to set that tone. And so if you are saying to people, we believe that the only criteria as to whether you're a man or a woman is self-identity, it becomes increasingly harder for individual organisations to have a policy that is in opposition to that. And that's what we've seen. And then the reality then becomes the person making these decisions is often, say, a lowly paid receptionist at the sports centre who is trying to tell somebody they can't go into a woman-only session. And they are not sure of their protections, they are not sure of the law, and they really, really need clarity. And because, as Lucy said, it's such a contested and confused area, and people don't have that clarity, the practical implications of doing this will affect areas like sport, even though it is possible to carve out the exceptions under the Equality Act.
What is living in your acquired gender? What does that mean? And so we have a provision that's indefinable and vague. No one checks up on it. Is somebody going to phone somebody and say, are you living in your acquired gender? And the person says yes or no. It's meaningless. So I strongly suspect that it's what's in the professional terms as a fig leaf. It's just a fig leaf to show that some provision has been put in there.
It's one of the few points of agreement, I would say, you're going to hear between witnesses on different sides of this debate, is that you'll hear evidence from people coming who support the bill and ourselves saying that living in an acquired gender is sexist and regressive and reinforces stereotypes. And you've heard it from Ellie, and you've got it in written submissions. It's a really problematic idea to have in legislation. Time periods are a slightly different thing, but the concept of living in an acquired gender is not one that you're going to find support.
Okay, I'm going to have to say thank you all so much, and I guess the point of consensus at the end there across different views is maybe a good place to end, so thanks for that, Lucy. Thanks to all of you, and obviously this has taken longer than you previously agreed to, so thanks for bearing with us. We have covered a huge amount of area, so I'll now suspend to change witnesses and for a 10-minute comfort break.